Welcome back. Well, could we have a saint from Northeast Wisconsin? The Green Bay Diocese is now investigating the life of Brice, the Northeast Wisconsin farm girl who reported an apparition of the Virgin Mary back in 1859. Where that happened is now the location of the National Shrine of Our Lady of Champion, the first Vatican-approved Marian apparition site in the United States. This investigation, the first step on the path to sainthood for Brice. Cami Rapson joining us now. She was speaking with the diocese today so we can learn a little bit more about this process. We know how many people are attracted to the shrine because of her story.
Well, there she is.
But there's so much more to her story. Is that behind this?
Yeah, so people go to the shrine because of the apparitions that she reported seeing back in 1859. And if you go there, you will see crutches and canes and walkers left behind. And a lot of that is attributed to the intercession, what people say the intercession of the Virgin Mary in their lives.
Okay.
And so that is a separate but yet parallel to Adele's story, obviously. What they are looking for, the Green Bay Diocese is looking for, are specific stories about Brice, about her life, how she may have changed others, potentially miracles attributed to her. She's buried right there on the grounds of the shrine. She spent her life, her adult life there, and she was basically a missionary 50 miles around. Just helping to teach children the Catholic faith. And so they think there are great-grandparents and stories that have been passed down because there's a very big Belgian influence out there that may know more about her.
All right, so the Great Peshtigo Fire has a role in this. What is it?
So the Great Peshtigo Fire, people believe that God's protection happened that day at that location of the shrine. The Peshtigo Fire happened in 1871, so right around that time. And that small, at the time, it was a wooden chapel there on those grounds, was spared.
Which is amazing, because not much wood was spared during the Peshtigo Fire.
And so it's far. You're thinking Peshtigo wasn't close, but the flames jumped, and it was
on
roaring.
The peninsula.
They were roaring. And a lot of farm families sought refuge there because of the apparitions that she saw, and that they believe that she might have some sort of intercession in that.
Maybe that doesn't qualify as a miracle, but you mentioned the word miracle before. How much of a role in the process does that play? What's next?
So there's not many American saints. There's only 11, and there are several more that are going through the different process. It's basically 3 steps to becoming a saint. She's in the fact-finding process right now. It will be kind of the process of examination. She's been called to be a servant of God, and that's what they will call her. The diocese collecting this information, collecting these stories. It's heading to Rome. It's going to Rome. And Pope Leo, a Chicago Pope, Pope from Chicago, will be looking at this to decide the next steps. It will be a decision that could make her venerable, which means that she would take that first step, that she led a virtuous life, and that it should be investigated further. And then they're going to look for these miracles. Any miracles attributed to her. 1, moves her along. 2, makes her a saint. But this could be decades. The timeline is really unknown. It's about how many stories come forward, how many people come forward, and what the Pope says. So so that's just an interesting.
All right, so it has now begun officially with the diocese seeking these stories. So if you have some, pass them along to the Green Bay Diocese.
AdeleBrice.org is the website they have set up.
Okay, terrific. Cami, thanks so much for this.